Okay, perfect. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm here today to talk about Flipper, the extensible development tool platform for React Native. My name is Michel Weststrate, as said, and I work at Facebook at the Flipper team. But before I talk about Flipper, I want to talk a little bit about history. So recently I was reading this book by James Holland, Normandy 44. It happens in France, so that sounded applicable to me. And I ran into an interesting analogy there. And so this author was of the unpopular opinion that in 1944, the Shermans were better tanks than Tigers. And that is generally an unpopular opinion because like Tiger tanks, they had better guns, they had better armaments, and basically Allies lost Sherman tanks to Tiger tanks 5-1. So you could say a Tiger tank was 5 times as good. But now, argues the author, the problem with the Tigers was that they were terribly expensive. So at the time, it took them in man-hours to build one Tiger tank. The Allies could build 30 Sherman tanks. And so what happened in the end was that there were like 500 Tiger tanks on the battlefield against 50,000 Sherman tanks. And so what this demonstrates is basically that development time is like super important. And I think that is basically the reason why React Native is such a good development platform for mobile applications. So what we see at Facebook, where we have people working on Android native, iOS, and React Native, is that React Native gives us the best time to pixel time. So that's basically how long does it take when you make a change in your code until you see it applied on the screen. And React Native is doing perfectly here, thanks to its fast refresh feature. But there's more to the story. So beyond the fact that Shermans were much, much cheaper to build, they had another benefit. They were way more simple and way more easy to maintain. They weren't as over-engineered. So what happened in practice is that when a German tank was knocked out, but not beyond recovery, it took them on average like 7 to 10 days to bring the same tank back into the field. For the Allies, however, they thought about their tool chain and logistics around tanks a lot better. So they had much more spare parts, and they had tools like low loaders, which are lorries that can like carry a tank away from the battlefield. And they could swap out an engine in a matter of hours. And so that meant that often they could bring the very same tank back into battle on the next day. And so that is basically what Flipper is for mobile development. It's the tooling that almost every mobile engineer at Facebook uses to analyze what is happening in the applications, being iOS or Android or Oculus or React Native. And so Flipper was developed at Facebook just to help with this need, give a better turnaround in analyzing what is happening. And so a few months ago, we released first-class support for Flipper in React Native. So React Native 62 ships with first-class support out of the box. So let me just quickly demonstrate what it looks like. So basically, if you go to fbflipper.com, you can download the installer. And I'm going to skip that for now. I did it already. And when you fire up Flipper, you basically see this empty application. But I also just generated a freshly generated React Native project. So this one is completely empty. Let's open it in code. And I'm going to change one thing. I'm going to use the Hermes engine on Android. I come back to that in a bit later. And beyond that, this is just a vanilla project, and I fire it up. And so this will take a little while. Let's wait until it's in the emulator. So there we go, an empty project. But Flipper is no longer empty. So what you see on the left is two devices, the emulator, in which the coins application is loaded, and the React Native connection. That is basically the connection with the Metro bundler. And so if we look at the emulator, we can see the crash reporter, which tells us when the application has a hard crash and why. And it shows all the logs coming from ADB. But we can also inspect all the logs from Metro itself and all logs from JavaScript. And best of all, the tool you might very well be familiar with is that we can directly use React Devtools on React Native from inside Flipper. But I told you before, Flipper was built for native development originally. So that means that it can also look in the underlying primitives of a React Native application. So what we're looking at here are the native elements that are used to construct your application. And so even with those native elements, we can now directly interact and modify them on the fly. So I just changed the text and you see that it works. So we can not only look at it at the React level, but also at the native level, what's happening. Same for example, the image caching, which is like loaded, or the preferences of the application, which we can interact with directly. And really cool, really useful is the networks plugin. So I can inspect all the network requests that are going out of the application, and I can filter on them and search for them. And I'll show you a little bit more of that later. So that is basically a very quick, brief overview of what Flipper does for React Native development. So it gives you the development tool to interact with both React Native world and the native world. So both on Android and on iOS. For the rest of this demo, I'm going to extend this application a little bit, and I'm going to make it a Bitcoin ticker, where it basically shows the current exchange rates of Bitcoins. And so in my demo, I want to demonstrate several different ways in which we can use Flipper to analyze what is going on in this application. So I go back to my application I just generated, remember? And on my clipboard, I have 3 files, a new app.js and 2 React components. I'm going to paste them into the folder, see fast refresh at work. And now I have this application that loads the Bitcoin data from some open endpoint. So the first part is the coin view component, which is basically responsible for fetching the data and then rendering it into a flat list. Now the flat list itself renders each item using the coin item component. And so I deconstruct rank and icon from it, but I'm interested in like what data is else available. And so one thing to go ahead with this is like basically do a console.log and see what it prints. So if I go to the Metro logs, there they are. So I see all the data being printed. I can figure out what fields are available in my data. But I could look at the same logs from Flipper. And that's nice because this is a bit more interactive. So here I can filter, I can copy the values, I can even check what log level I'm interested in. So this is a lot more interactive way to looking at the same logs. But logs are generally a bit annoying way of debugging as they get messy very quickly. So the better thing we can do is like look at a network request. So in the network inspector, I can find any relevant request happening and go into the response body. And so this, since this request happens to be a JSON request, it does nicely render an interactive tree where I can see what data I'm receiving from the endpoint. But we can do even something fancier. We can connect this application to the Hermes debugger. And so that uses the Chrome debugger protocol under the hood and connects to the Hermes engine and React Native app. And so I can simply set a breakpoint, wait for it to be hit, and then inspect the very same data from inside the debugger and see what I'm receiving. So basically, I have now a general ID what data I'm receiving, and this nicely demonstrates that I have several ways to find out what's there. So let's leverage that knowledge and slightly extend this application. So I'm going to introduce some views and some text elements to display this data. Now I prepared some styles already. So let's deconstruct the fields from the coin object, copy paste this a little bit, apply some prepared styles, and also apply some formatting. And so we save this, and again, we see fast refresh at work, and we have basically our coin application. And so this nicely demonstrates on how many more angles you can look at your application beyond just a console.log statement. Now, Flipper ships with all those things out of the box already. But it was designed for extensibility. And for example, at Facebook, we have many more plugins than you will see in the open source version. But if you think about plugins, you can basically divide them into two categories. One is application-specific plugins. So you can write plugins that are very specific for your application. So for example, at Facebook, we have plugins that when we interact with the marketplace, we can see what the underlying data is. Or when we look at the newsfeed, we have plugin that shows the loading order. But beyond that, there's also, you can write very generic plugins. For example, a plugin that shows the state of your Redux store, for example. And those can be published on NPM, and you can directly install them into Flipper with the plugin manager. So what I want to do next is build a specific plugin for specifically our Bitcoin application. So to understand what we're going to do, let me first show you the architecture of how Flipper works. So Flipper Desktop is basically an Electron application in which plugins are loaded, and those are the plugins you see in the sidebar. And also, every plugin has its counterpart in the mobile application. So either in the native world, which is true for most plugins, that's why we can see all the network requests happening, for example. But you can also write plugins in the JavaScript world, specifically in the case of React Native. And those interact with the native SDKs using the React Native Flipper package. So that is what we are going to do. We're going to fill in those two red boxes. So the problem, as I said, is that we're logging a lot of data, and it gets very annoying very quickly. So let's build a plugin that is specific, useful to analyze all the Bitcoin data. So we remove that log statement we had before. And the first thing we are going to do is to generate a plugin for the desktop application. So I can do that using the Flipper package tool, which can scaffold a fresh project. So I call it coins. Coins is identifier we use to connect from the mobile side. And that scaffolds a project. We run yarn once. And that installs and builds the initial version. And we can open this now in Visual Studio Code. So this is a very simple empty plugin. And a plugin is basically a React component with some other static methods to store the data. So we have persistent state reducer that keeps track of all the incoming messages and transform them. So now if I reopen Flipper, this plugin will be loaded into it. And I can inspect it by going to on the bottom left to the Manage Plugins button. And there we see that the Coins plugin has been loaded indeed. let's load this. Let's leave the plugin vanilla as it is already, and first head to the React Native world. And so in this coin view component, I'm going to add instantiate a Flipper plugin. I just created by creating an empty object, which has to implement three methods. GetID, this is an identifier used to connect to the correct desktop plugin. And there are two event handlers, onConnect and onDisconnect. And onConnect receives a connection object, which we can use to send data. Now I'm going to give this plugin a send coins operation, which I can use to send arbitrary data over the connection to the desktop. Now I have this object, and only in debug builds, I'm going to register this as a plugin to Flipper. So for that, I use React Native Flipper, which remind me I didn't install it yet. So let's add it quickly. Yarn add -d React Native Flipper. There we go. And so the only thing we now have to do is when we receive fresh data from the endpoint, we're going to send that through the plugin to Flipper. So I just sent my coins JSON data there. Now I do need to restart my React Native application once because I just installed a new native dependency. So it has to rebuild, but just this time. In the meantime, I also start a watcher on the desktop plugin, remember, the one we generated, so that we can apply changes there as well. And so now the plugin is available. So let's enable it. Let's wait for some data to come in. And here we see a raw dump of all the data we receive over the connection. So this is what the plugin, the freshly scaffolded plugin does by default. So let's make this a little bit nicer. Now on my clipboard, I have a slightly better version of this. So let's paste it. It's not that much better, but let's see if the changes are picked up. Yes, they are. Let's wait for some new data. And so I changed the plugin a little bit, and so it aggregates all the data per coin, and also over time keeps track of a delta, so that you can see what is really happening to the underlying data in our application. So this now nicely updates every few seconds. So under the hood, what I changed, I made a strongly typed, so I introduced a coin type. I wrote a small styled component that's depending on the delta, it makes it black, green, or red. And in the reducer, whenever for every received coin, if it doesn't exist yet, I create a new entry, and otherwise I update and I calculate the fresh delta. And so then the last thing is I simply map over the coins and I render them using that row component. Now, this is obviously still pretty primitive, but at least it shows you how you can get data into Flipper and render it. So that's as having data going in one direction, but we can also send it the other way around. So we can also use Flipper to control what's happening in our application. And so that's what we are going to do in our next demo. So we have still this request going on all the time, like every few seconds. And that is pretty annoying pretty quickly. Because if you're inspecting something and all those requests are coming in or they're being clogged up, that's annoying. So let's introduce a small toolbar, introduce a button, give it on click handler, and then we send to the application using our client connection the pause command. And so the toolbar and button and a lot of other components, they're all provided by the Flipper SDK. So there we have it, our fresh button to pause and resume. Now, of course, we have to do something with that command on the React Native side. So what we can do with that connection object is we cannot only use it to send data, but we can also listen for incoming commands from the Flipper side. So I can attach a callback to receiving the pause command. And that callback gets some params, which we now ignore. And it has a responder object, with which we can send an object back. In this case, we don't need to send anything. And we're going to just introduce this pause method, which is going to call a set paused, which is a setter of a React use state hook. And so in the coming view, I'm going to introduce the concept of being paused using use state. Now, if this is a debug build again, I'm going to give that set pause handler to the coins plugin. And so then the only thing left to do is make the effect depend on the is pause state. And if pause is true, then we can simply bail out. So let's save it. Let's refresh. Wait for it to load. And so now the data is still ticking. So we see it changing. But if we pause it, it doesn't tick anymore. Now that's not super obvious. So just for the sake of this demo, let's visualize that effect. So based on this pause state, I'm going to render some state wrapped in a fragment. Again, save it. So you already see the normal text being rendered. The data is still being fetched. So there's some data. And in the meantime, when I press pause, we see immediately the state of the application switching to paused and switching back to normal again. So that nicely shows you how simple it is to set up bidirectional communication and control your mobile app from Flipper to help you with debugging. Now that is basically a summary of how straightforward it is to build your own application-specific plugin. But there's also quite a few community plugins. For example, there's Reactortron. Many of you might already be familiar with that tool, but it's now is available as Flipper plugin as well, which makes it easier to install because it can leverage all the infrastructure already present for Flipper. And so with Reactortron, you can analyze your Redux store, your Redux sagas, your Mobix state tree. It has loads of plugins. It can have custom commands. So that is a pretty advanced thing you can use. But the one I want to quickly show you is a different one. It's the Redux Debugger plugin I ran into a couple of weeks ago. And so let's find it back inside the plugin manager in Flipper. Because this is published in NPM, I can install it directly from within Flipper. Now, of course, I have to also install something into the React Native application. So for that, I go to its website and follow the instructions provided there. So React Native Flipper we already have, but we still have to add the Redux Flipper bindings. So let's copy this. Let's paste it. We also need Redux because we didn't have Redux in this application yet. And while that is installing, I also install the desktop plugin into Flipper. That's just pressing two buttons. Flipper currently does still require a restart for that, but that will be fixed in the future as well. And so now the only thing left is to wire this up in our React Native application. Now it doesn't have Redux yet, so I'm just going to write the most simple, ugly Redux store ever. I have a root reducer that basically takes as the next state any payload I provide to any action I send to it. I'm not going to wire this up. I just want the Redux store to store some data just for this demo. And so if this is a debug build, I can apply to the Redux store this Redux Flipper middleware, which is provided by the bindings I just installed. And so that's everything I need to do to connect Redux to my Flipper application now. So now I can dispatch to the store the same piece of JSON and go to Flipper. And so the DevTools should now show up, the ones for Redux. Let's wait until they get loaded. Yes, there they are. So I have now a new plugin, the Redux Debugger. It's connected to the application, so I can enable it. And now for every action that comes in, it shows up in this action list. And when I look at the action, I can see the changes it made to the store. So it generates a diff for that. Or I can look at the store holistically and inspect everything that's in there. And so the nice thing is that this is a generic plugin that everybody can use. But what I also like about it is that all the components you see, the state tree, the diffing, the table with the search, those are all standard components provided by the Flipper SDK. So this desktop plugin, I think it's less than 200 lines of code. It's just a bunch of React markup. And so that is basically the essence of what I want to share with you. Do build tools that reduce your mean time to recovery. The better you can analyze what's happening in your application, the easier it will be to maintain it in the long term, and the more effective you will be in the long term. And I think that's something Flipper for React Native is now uniquely positioned for. So give it a try. Do remember that Flipper is an open source project, so you can freely contribute to it. You can suggest plugins, you can create them. I'm really curious to see what you come up with. And with that, I basically want to leave you. So feel free to follow up with any questions.
I remember your talk last year from React Europe, which was the MobX state tree, I think combining GraphQL and MobX state tree. So you showed a Redux plugin. Is there a similar one like that for MobX?
Yes. So for that, I recommend to use the Rectotron one, which already supports MobX state tree out of the box.
Hey, Sean.
Great. Do you have a question for him, Patrick?
Yeah, does it work with the Expo client? I'm guessing yes.
I gave it a quick try, and it didn't work when I tried it, but I didn't figure out yet why.
Okay, we need to ask Brent or something.
So we also had a question coming from the comments on the Discord server. How well does it work with Windows at the moment? For example, network inspection seems to be unavailable when they debug their Android app.
So we made recently a lot of fixes in the Windows department. So as far as I know, as we are aware now, everything should work on Windows. If it doesn't, please do file an issue, because we have been quite active.
Yeah, so try it again. If not, leave an issue on Facebook/Flipper. Great. How do you debug a Flipper plugin? Is it just intuitive and regular, or is there something special you have to do?
No, that's pretty regular. I mean, like, we always are joking about creating a Flipper plugin to debug Flipper and then go entirely meta.
Yes.
But no, it's an Electron application. And so you can use the normal Chrome debugger for that. What we do recommend is, so my demo was entirely with the pre-built version of Flipper. What you do recommend, though, is if you develop a lot of plugins, is to run it from source. That's just a matter of yarn install and yarn start. But that makes the experience, especially for debugging, better, because then you get a development build for React with better error messages, you get fast refresh out of the box, that kind of stuff.
Okay. All right. Another one just came in from YouTube. What do you recommend for debugging JavaScript core? Is Hermes coming to iOS 2? I don't even know what that means, but
honestly, I'm not sure about the state of Hermes for iOS.
okay.
So hard to answer. I think that's better asked directly at React Native team.
I don't think it's allowed by Apple.
Yeah, that's probably the issue. That's not allowed.
There's a compiler in there.
So as someone who is new to React Native, and I haven't really played with React Native a whole lot, but I was wondering if you could give me a quick summarization of what the differences were between the app-specific and the generic plugins, because that was lost on me a little bit in the talk.
So it's not a technical difference. It's just like how I like to think conceptually about it. So a generic plugin is a plugin that is relevant for a larger audience, while an app-specific plugin is one you just built specifically to understand your specific app better. So, for example, I render trends of the coin data, which is very specific for my application. It's not a technical difference.
So specifically to your application or your team or not, it might not be applicable to other users and the rest of the community. Building off of that question, do you have a favorite community contributed plugin that you really like, other than the ones that you showed here?
React
There's a really cool one which analyzes the React Native startup time. It's a native plugin. It's not a React-based one. But it collects data on the whole starter process and then sends it afterwards when it's loaded to Flipper. And it gives a lot of insight. And it's really a pretty advanced, cool plugin.
Good. So check that out, everyone. Also, Swix, I believe you had a question.
Yeah. Well, I just a couple of comments. Like, I think that app-specific, DevTools idea is really interesting. Like, it really goes with your message of reducing mean time to recovery. Everyone should be like, Flipper is such a genius idea because it enables everyone to build their own DevTools. And it's somewhere sitting in between. It's like a test. It's something that helps you debug internal state and simulate whatever you want, just like reach into the internals of your app as you test it. So it just seems like a pretty cool idea that I wish like browser DevTools were easier to make so that people could just reach in there. And then the other comment that I had is, like, as someone who gives live coding talks, that was a very good live coding talk. Like, you didn't make any mistakes. It's very easy to follow.
I agree too.
It was very well organized, and then you switched like between the slides and your demos and your live coding really, really smoothly. So I don't know how much you practice for that, but that was just really amazing.
I think that's the test for all speakers. Can they switch between their code and their slides very quickly and efficiently?
Honestly, I did pre-record them.
Okay.
All right. And then the question that I had was, I just obviously I see that your workflow is kind of bound to Yarn v1. Is there a deeper reason for sticking to Yarn? Because I see some people moving to npm, and has Yarn v2 resolved its React Native issues?
No, that's mostly historical. We don't have any problem with Yarn 1, so we don't see any immediate value of switching over.
Got it. So we have a few more questions rolling in. We answered the one that they just asked in the YouTube. Does it work with Expo? It does, but there's a few issues I think maybe we've talked about. But someone asked, I want to test Bluetooth functionality for Android and React Native, but I only have one device. Can you suggest a solution? I want to test.
Oh, like connecting with other devices using Bluetooth?
Yeah, I guess
what you could do is, I guess, build a web page and use the Bluetooth APIs available in Chrome.
Interesting. And then second question, can I use Flipper to debug production React Native apps?
No, we very deliberately strip those things out of production builds. I mean, the connection between Flipper and native, the mobile applications it is secured, and there's some complicated certificate exchange stuff happening. I don't fully understand. But yes, just we don't want to have that stuff that basically allows one to get data out of a running application in production. We don't want to have it in production. So everything is very deliberately stripped out.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
Yeah, I was just going to say, is there any limitations to other types of React Native applications that Flipper won't work for? I'm thinking like, I guess, older legacy apps or anything like that.
No, I don't think so. Okay. So there are instructions on how to install it on all apps. And I also see people using it for actually native desktop applications, for example. We see it used there as well. We have like Swift and C and Java bindings all for Flipper.
Yep.
So
well, I just wanted to add that the talk was very great, and I'm always looking to try to get into React Native, and this was a talk that kind of made me very eager to try it, especially that you have all these wonderful tools to be able to help debug your application, which is very important. Thank you.
Yeah, I saw like the mention of fast refresh as well. It came first to React Native. Like it seems like Facebook is investing a lot, and it's React Native is just growing much better every year. It's really awesome to watch.
Yeah, it's so improving so fast.
Thanks, Michel. It was great to have you, and we're gonna get to the next talk.